if you could somehow slide back through 600-odd years, you would find that the foundations of the entire British monarchy don't actually rest on the broad shoulders of Henry VIII, who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, or the grand naval charts of Elizabeth I. No, it all sits on the frail, strangely small shoulders of an early teenage girl who spent most of her life waiting, praying until her knees bled, and outsmarting every single man who thought he ran the shop. This is the story of Lady Margaret Beaufort, a woman who never got to wear the crown herself, partly because she was a woman, partly because the plumbing of medieval politics was an absolute nightmare, but she essentially built the bloody thing from scratch with her own bare hands. It's a tale of survive or get chopped, really, full of letters, fake marriages, and an obsession with a son she barely knew. And if you think the modern royals have a bit of drama, well, you haven't seen anything yet. So, let's start in Bletchley, or near it, anyway, a place called Westerning in Bedfordshire, though she was actually born at Bletsoe Castle. The day is May 31st, 1443. Her father, John Beaufort, was a man who was spectacularly bad at his job, which at the time was fighting the French. He'd just bungled a military campaign so badly that the court was laughing at him, and he was broke, and he was miserable. He took one look at his newborn daughter, realised she wasn't a boy who could fight the French to win back his reputation, and then, about a year later, he died. Some people said it was a fever, but honestly, the gossip at the tavern was that he killed himself because he couldn't face the shame of being a total failure. Suicide was a massive sin back then. You couldn't get buried in holy ground if you did it, so everyone hushed it up, but the timing is suspicious to say the least. Suddenly, this tiny baby, Margaret, is the sole heir to a staggering fortune. We are talking vast swathes of land, manors, villages, and a bloodline that went straight back to Edward III through a bunch of legitimised bastards called the Beauforts. The king, Henry VI, who was lovely but mentally about as stable as a three-legged stool, looks at this infant girl and sees a giant pile of money. In those days, if a noble died and left an underage heir, the king got wardship. It was basically a medieval car boot sale where the king could sell the right to look after the child and, more importantly, spend their income to the highest bidder. Henry gives the wardship to William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. Suffolk was a slippery customer, the sort of man who'd sell you a horse with 3 legs and convince you it was a spare. He decides that the best way to keep Margaret's money in his own pocket forever is to marry her to his own son, John de la Pole. Margaret is 3 years old when this administrative paperwork happens. John is about 7. They even had to get a special dispensation from the Pope because they were technically cousins, which everyone was back then because the aristocracy was essentially one village. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, everyone was called Margaret, it gets incredibly confusing, was a tough old bird who had already buried 2 husbands and knew exactly how cruel the world could be to an unprotected woman. She taught her daughter to read, which wasn't standard for girls then, though it was usually just religious books in French and Latin. Then everything shifts because Suffolk, the sneaky guardian, gets himself impeached by a parliament that hated his guts for losing more land to the French. He tries to flee the country in a small boat, but some sailors intercept him, give him a mock trial on the deck of a ship called the Nicholas of the Tower, and chop his head off with a rusty sword. It took them about 6 strokes, apparently. Dreadful business. With Suffolk out of the picture, King Henry VI cancels the childhood marriage between Margaret and little John de la Pole. It's wiped from the record as if it never happened, which must have been a bit strange for Margaret, being technically a divorcee before she'd even lost her milk teeth. The king decides he wants her fortune for his own family now. He has 2 half-brothers, Edmund Tudor and Jasper Tudor, who are Welsh and don't have 2 pennies to rub together. Their mother was Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, who had secretly married a handsome Welsh clerk of the wardrobe named Owen Tudor. It was a big scandal at the time. The king assigns Margaret's wardship to his eldest half-brother, Edmund Tudor. Edmund is roughly 21 years old, Margaret is 9. He looks at this little girl and sees his ticket to the big leagues. He doesn't just want her lands, he wants her body to produce a child that will carry the royal Lancastrian bloodline into the next generation. They wait until she is 12, which was the legal age of consent back then, though mentally and physically. She was still just a child who probably wanted to play in the garden rather than become a political incubator. The wedding happens in late 1455. There's no record of whether she cried, but she almost certainly did. She is packed up and sent away from the familiar fields of Bedfordshire, away from her mother, and dragged across the border into Wales, to people speaking a language that sounded to English ears like someone gargling gravel. That was their take, not mine, so don't take it to heart if you're Welsh. They end up at Lampthe Palace in Pembrokeshire, which was a residence of the bishops of St. David's. Edmund wastes absolutely no time. Within a few months of the ceremony, the 12-year-old Margaret is pregnant. That was Margaret's life after the Suffolk business collapsed. The daily routine was brutal. Her mother, that ferocious Beauchamp woman, was determined that Margaret shouldn't grow up soft. So she had her out of bed at dawn for matins, then prime, then mass. If you weren't on your knees by 6 in the morning, you were practically an atheist in the 1450s. Margaret took to it with a strange, almost frightening intensity. She wasn't just doing it to please her mum. She seemed to genuinely find comfort in the rhythm of the Latin prayers, maybe because the saints were the only people in her life who weren't trying to sell her off to a cousin. She developed this habit of weeping during prayers, which sounds a bit dramatic. But back then, the gift of tears was considered a major spiritual upgrade. It showed you were properly feeling the misery of the world. And let's face it, she had plenty to cry about. Margaret's relationship with the heavens wasn't so much one of humble submission as it was a two-way boardroom meeting. She didn't just pray for divine assistance, she essentially treated the Almighty as a senior business partner who sat across the table, nodded at her ledger books, and co-signed her political policy decisions before they were even sent to the printers. If she wanted to break a legal marriage contract at age 9, she didn't just claim a whim. She told people St. Nicholas had personally dropped into her bedroom at 4 in the morning to give the Tudor match his full celestial backing. There was this terrifyingly calm certainty in her letters that suggested if God and Margaret Beaufort happened to disagree on who should be sitting on the throne of England, it was definitely the Creator who needed to go back and check his notes. Everyone knew the king's health was failing. Henry VI had started having these catatonic fits where he couldn't move or speak for months on end. You could walk into his bedroom, shout in his face, drop a silver tray on the floor, and he'd just sit there staring at the wall like a stuffed owl. Some historians suggest that catatonic schizophrenia or a severe depressive stupor were the underlying medical causes, likely triggered by the trauma of losing English territories in France. This condition may have been inherited from his French grandfather, Charles VI, who famously believed he was made of glass and might shatter if someone touched his elbow. So, don't beat yourself up when you lose something, otherwise you'll end up losing your mind too. Because the king was out of it, everyone else started grabbing whatever they could. The Duke of York wanted the throne. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, another Margaret, was trying to protect her own baby boy. Everyone needed money to buy soldiers. And who had the biggest pile of cash sitting in a vault? Our little 12-year-old friend at Maxey Castle, her mother's castle. Edmund Tudor shows up around this point to claim his prize. He was the king's half-brother, as I mentioned, but he was also remarkably skint. His father, Owen Tudor, had spent time in Newgate prison just for being married to the old queen, so the family wasn't exactly sitting pretty on a mountain of old money. Edmund arrives with a massive retinue of Welsh horsemen to take Margaret away. Her mother couldn't do anything to stop it because the king's word was law, even when the king was currently incapable of feeding himself. I suspect Margaret knew exactly what was coming. She'd been raised on stories of holy virgins who died rather than give up their chastity. But in the real world of 15th-century real estate, that wasn't an option on the menu. There's this odd legend, Margaret told it herself years later, so we have to take it with a pinch of salt, that before she agreed to the Tudor match, she couldn't decide between Edmund or another suitor. She claimed she prayed to St. Nicholas, the patron saint of boys, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, the saint appeared to her in a dream. He was dressed in white, apparently, and told her she must marry Edmund. It's a nice story, isn't it? Very pious. but I can't help thinking it sounds exactly like the kind of story a clever girl invents to make a miserable situation look like God's personal plan. If the alternative was admitting your family traded you like a prize heifer, you'd probably blame a ghost in white too. Her body was still growing. She hadn't even reached her full height, which turned out to be quite short, barely 5 feet if the effigies are anything to go by. They finally reached Caldicot Castle in Monmouthshire before moving further west. This was her new reality. The safe, enclosed world of her mother's garden at Maxey was gone, replaced by a husband who was old enough to be her father, and a political situation that was about to explode into what we now call the Wars of the Roses. Though nobody called it that then, of course. They just called it the Trouble. People don't talk enough about how utterly chaotic that first childhood wedding to John de la Pole really was, probably because the Beauforts spent the next 40 years trying to erase it from every piece of skin and stone in the kingdom. Margaret was, what, 6? 7? It depends on which clerk you believe, since 15th-century record-keeping was mostly done by monks who were half-blind from working by rushlight. They stood in a church, maybe at winged Suffolk's Place, or perhaps right under her mother's nose at Maxey, and mumbled the words that made them man and wife in the eyes of a god who was presumably quite busy with the Black Death and the collapse of the French Empire. Her mother was already looking out for the next bidder, checking the ledger books, counting the sheep on their estates because wool was the real currency of England back then. If you had enough wool, you could buy anything, even a king's brother. The Tudor boys were waiting. Edmund and his brother Jasper were the ultimate outsiders at court, half Welsh, half French, and had that fierce tribal loyalty that you only find in families that have had to fight for every single scrap of bread on their plate. Edmund was ambitious in that specific, desperate way of a man who knows he's only one step away from being a nobody again. He wanted Margaret's money to build his power base in the Welsh marches, where the law was basically whatever you could enforce with 50 men and some sharp bills. It's about this time that Margaret started carrying around a specific book of hours, a prayer book that she kept for the rest of her life. Back to main timeline. When they finally reached Caldicot Castle, they rode west toward Pembroke Castle. Edmund didn't stay with her long. The country was sliding into total chaos because the Duke of York had effectively launched a coup d'etat against the king, and South Wales was a hornet's nest of feuding warlords who changed sides based on who had the most silver or the sharpest axes. Edmund went off to secure Carmarthen Castle for the Lancastrian side, leaving his child wife alone in Pembroke with a handful of Welsh servants whose English was probably non-existent. She was already pregnant. Her belly was growing. Then the Yorkists struck. A bloke named William Herbert, a terrifyingly efficient Yorkist enforcer who was known as the Black William because of his dark hair, marched on Carmarthen with an army of hardened Marcher gentry. He besieged Edmund, took him prisoner, and threw him into a damp dungeon. Edmund was 26, supposedly strong and healthy, but medieval prisons were basically death sentences wrapped in stone. He caught the plague, or a very nasty flux, nobody is entirely certain. He was dead, just like that. Margaret was 13, 5 months pregnant, completely alone in a hostile country, and her husband's corpse was rotting in Carmarthen. If the Yorkists came for Pembroke, she had no army to defend it. She had her dowry, she had her swollen belly, and she had her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, who was currently hiding in the woods somewhere trying to raise an army of Welsh coal miners and farmers. She didn't have time to mourn Edmund, even if she had wanted to, which is doubtful considering he'd spent the last year treating her like a piece of livestock. She had to figure out how to keep herself and the creature growing inside her from being wiped off the map before the winter was out, her own body betraying her by carrying the very thing that made her a target for every ambitious killer between Cardiff and Carlisle. She ordered the household servants to buy heavy wool blankets from the market in Haverfordwest, and she had them steep iron spikes in vinegar to keep the rust off the gates. She was preparing for a siege, not just of the castle, but of her entire life, and she didn't have a single soul she could trust to tell her if she'd see the spring. The date was January 1457, when she gave birth to Henry VII. Margaret was tiny. Her bones weren't fully set. Some accounts from the time imply she nearly died on the pallet bed. Jasper had managed to scramble back into the castle just in time to ensure the baby wasn't stolen by Yorkist agents. The physical damage to Margaret from this birth was immense, so severe that she never had another child, despite being married twice more to perfectly healthy men who definitely wanted heirs. Her body just said, "No, thank you, we've done that," and it was bloody awful. The Yorkists were getting closer. William Herbert was consolidating his grip on the region, his shadow lengthening over Pembroke like a bad winter evening. Margaret had to look at this tiny bundle of skin and hair and realise that he was both her greatest joy and a massive walking death warrant. If the Yorkist boys found out the Duke of Somerset's grandson was sitting in a cradle in West Wales. She began to draft letters in her head. She was remarkably good at that. Even at 13, her letters were written to appear loyal to the ruling Lancastrian regime on the surface, but they carried coded messages meant only for her closest allies. She used a cipher sometimes, using numbers instead of vowels, a trick she'd picked up from a French clerk her mother used to employ at Maxey. Jasper Tudor was a proper giant of a bloke, or at least that's how he comes across in the old Welsh poems. He took one look at his tiny sister-in-law and his new nephew, and decided he had to become their human shield. He was only 26 himself, let's remember. A young man suddenly playing dad and general all at once while the whole country was tearing itself apart. They hunkered down together in that massive fortress for months. Margaret's life became this weird, suspended reality of watching her baby grow, while Jasper spent his time inspecting the castle walls, checking the grain stores and shouting at the local Welsh blacksmiths to sharpen more pikes. They had to stay put. Moving was suicide. Jasper kept the Yorkists at bay for a good few years through sheer force of personality and some very clever local deals with the Pembrokeshire gentry, who were always happy to nod and say, "Yes, my lord," as long as he had 50 archers standing behind him. But the wider war was going spectacularly badly for their side. The Lancastrians lost a massive battle at Towton up north, a total bloodbath in a snowstorm where some chroniclers claimed 28,000 men died in a single afternoon. After that, the Yorkist leader Edward IV took the crown in 1461, and everything in Wales started falling apart. William Herbert, that dark Yorkist enforcer, came marching west with a proper army this time, and Jasper realised the game was up. He couldn't defend Pembroke against a full artillery train with just a few dozen Welshmen. He had to run. Margaret was left sitting in the great hall, holding a 4-year-old Henry by the hand, and waited for the door to open. Herbert didn't kill them. He was a ruthless bastard, but he wasn't a monster. He knew the value of a royal ward. He took Pembroke Castle for himself, moved his own massive family into the state apartments, and basically adopted little Henry Tudor, or rather, he kept him as a gilded prisoner who might be useful later, if the political wind changed again. She had to leave her boy behind in Herbert's custody. So she's 18, she's completely destitute in terms of actual liquid cash, and she's just been separated from her only child. For 3 years prior to that, Margaret lived with her new husband, Henry Stafford. It was an arrangement of pure convenience. She needed a man with an army to stop people stealing her manors, and he needed a girl with a rent roll that could pay for his costs. Margaret and her new husband spent a lot of time travelling between Bourne and their other properties. She tried to look entirely harmless so the Yorkist king, Edward IV, wouldn't think she was plotting a rebellion. Her boy was still out in Wales with the Herberts, growing up into a young man who spoke with a Welsh lilt, and didn't really remember what his mother looked like. She sent him gifts whenever she could, but she wasn't allowed to see him. By 1469, Richard Neville, the bloke they called the Kingmaker, because he had more money than sense and liked moving kings around like chess pieces, decided he hated Edward IV and wanted to put the old, mad King Henry VI back on the throne, because he was furious that Edward IV was ignoring his political advice, cozying up to the upstart Woodville family and refusing to align with France, with more wealth and land than the king himself. Warwick briefly arrested Edward IV, but soon realised it was impossible to govern without a puppet monarch. He was forced to release him, but in 1470 he struck a deal with his former archenemy, Henry VI's fiercely ambitious wife, Margaret of Anjou. With French backing, Warwick invaded England, drove Edward IV into exile in Burgundy. This was the readeption, A bizarre few months where they dragged the poor old man out of the Tower of London, put a clean robe on him, and stuck him back on the seat of power even though he looked like he'd been dug up from a churchyard. The puppet show didn't last long. Edward IV returned from exile in the spring of 1471. Henry Stafford was torn. He'd been trying to be a good Yorkist, and despite his family's Lancastrian blood, he chose to stick to his allegiance to the Yorkist king. He buckled on his iron harness and went out to fight for Edward at the Battle of Barnet, where they smashed Warwick's army and the kingmaker himself was killed. Henry Stafford died on October, from severe wounds sustained months earlier at the Battle of Barnet, rather than the Battle of Tewkesbury, leaving Margaret Beaufort preoccupied with nursing him in his final days and removed from the unfolding events in Wales. Meanwhile, her 14-year-old boy Henry is pinned down in South Wales at Pembroke Castle, and the triumphant Yorkist king Edward IV wants him very badly. Dead or alive, preferably dead, because Henry is suddenly the last male with a shred of Lancastrian royal blood left standing after the bloodbath at Tewkesbury. The notorious Black William had already been executed in 1469 and was not the one besieging the castle. Instead, Jasper Tudor and his young nephew Henry found themselves besieged inside Pembroke Castle in 1471 by the forces of Morgan ap Thomas, a Yorkist loyalist. After 8 days of a suffocating siege, rescue arrived via David ap Thomas, Morgan's own brother, but a Lancastrian loyalist, who attacked his brother's forces and lifted the siege. This allowed Jasper to immediately take Henry and flee through secret tunnels to the coastal town of Tenby, sailing into exile. A massive gale blows up and violently sweeps them off course, tossing them onto the rocky coast of Brittany instead. Brittany wasn't France back then. It was its own independent duchy run by an incredibly shrewd duke named Francis II, who looked at this teenage boy arriving on his beach and realised he'd just been handed a gold-plated political bargaining chip. He puts Henry and Jasper under a kind of polite house arrest in a castle called La Goe. Henry would spend the next 14 years there, waiting to see if the English king would offer enough gold to buy his head. Margaret is stuck in England, completely cut off from him. If she writes a letter to him and a Yorkist spy intercepts it, she's looking at a one-way trip to the block, so she has to stay entirely silent, pretending to the court that she's just a pious, harmless widow who spends all her time embroidery stitching cushions and reading about saints. She had to sit by her fire in Lincolnshire and just wait. It's the waiting that drives you mad, isn't it? The sheer, gnawing uncertainty of not knowing if your only child is going to survive the night, or if a hired killer has already slipped a knife between his ribs while he slept in that French tower. She started tracking his life through the gossip brought back by merchants who traded wool in the ports of St. Malo and Bristol. She'd have her agents hang around the taverns just to ask if they'd heard anything about the English lords at the Breton court. He became a master of survival just like his mum, watching the political chessboard from across the water while she quietly began to line up her own pieces back in London. So, with her boy safely locked away in a Breton birdcage, Margaret needs a new mask. She can't just sit in the fens being a target for the Yorkist crown tax collectors, so she does something completely wild but brilliant. She marries Thomas Stanley. Now, if you look up the word turncoat in a proper 17th-century dictionary, there ought to be a little woodcut illustration of Stanley's face right next to it, because this bloke was the absolute master of changing sides at the 11th hour. He had this massive private army up in Lancashire and Cheshire, thousands of rough northern blokes who do whatever he told them, and he used them like a lever to squeeze favours out of whoever happened to be sitting on the throne that morning. He'd been a Lancastrian, then a Yorkist, then a Lancastrian again, then back to Yorkist, depending entirely on who was winning the match. The wedding happens around June 1472. Stanley wanted her massive southern estates to add to his northern empire, and Margaret wanted his political protection in London because he was currently the Lord Steward of the king's household, meaning he had the ear of Edward IV every single day. They didn't even pretend to have a normal marriage. Years later, Margaret would even take a vow of chastity, with Thomas's permission, which must have been a bit of a relief for the old boy, frankly, allowing them to focus entirely on the family business of surviving the court, and eventually plotting treason. Margaret moves into the thick of the London scene, right under the nose of the Yorkist king. She gets herself appointed as one of Queen Elizabeth Woodville's ladies-in-waiting, which means she is literally carrying the Queen's train at court ceremonies, nodding along to all the gossip and pretending to be absolutely delighted whenever the Yorkist princes do anything clever. She became this invisible fixture of the palace, the quiet lady in the black hood who was always praying in the corner or organising the royal household, while her sharp little eyes were busy taking notes on who hated whom and which ministers could be bought. The king completely fell for it. He thought she was just a harmless, dried-up old thing who had given up on the world because her cause was dead, and he even started talking about letting little Henry Tudor come back to England to marry one of his daughters. Even she was briefly on board with the idea of securing his safety and return under a Yorkist-Lancastrian union. She started spending her pocket money on books again. She found this new bloke named William Caxton, who had set up a printing press near Westminster Abbey, using these clacking wooden machines that make multiple copies of texts in English instead of Latin. Margaret loved it. She became one of his biggest fans and financial backers, buying up translations of French romances and religious manuals, because she realised that if you control the books people read, you control how they think about the world. It was a very modern way of building a brand, decades before anyone else in England had even figured out what a printing press was actually good for. April 1483. Edward IV drops dead completely out of the blue, presumably because his liver simply gave up after years of high-volume drinking. This leaves everything in a total mess. The heir, little Edward V, is only 12, and his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Margaret has been carrying the train for, is suddenly terrified that the old guard nobility will tear her family to ribbons. Margaret sees her opening. She positions herself right beside the frantic Queen, while her brain is running 1,000 calculations a second about how to leverage this catastrophe for her own boy across the water. The dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, swoops down from the north, intercepts the boy king, sticks him in the Tower of London for safekeeping, and takes over the government. The Woodville clan panics completely. Elizabeth Woodville grabs her remaining kids, rushes into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Margaret doesn't go into sanctuary with her. She stays on the outside, using her position as Stanley's wife to pass back and forth between the Abbey and the palace. There's a Welsh physician in London at the time called Lewis Caerleon, who is basically the middleman for the whole operation, because he's got a licence to visit both the Queen in sanctuary to check on her health and Margaret in her London house. He must have been a brave bloke, because carrying secret letters between these two women under the nose of Richard's guards could have got his skin peeled off in the courtyard if he'd been caught. Margaret starts pitching a wild idea to Elizabeth through these secret notes. The plan is simple, but ridiculously ambitious. They should combine forces. If Elizabeth supports Margaret's exiled son, Henry Tudor, when he invades, Henry will marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. This would stitch the two warring houses together, Lancaster and York, and give everyone an excuse to stop hacking each other to pieces in the mud. The Queen realises she doesn't have any better options. She says yes. The letters start flying across the English Channel now. Margaret uses a trusted servant named Christopher Urswick, a quiet priest who looked like he wouldn't bungle a grocery order, let alone a treasonous plot, to take the messages down to the coast, where they were smuggled onto fishing boats bound for the Breton ports. She was financing the whole thing out of her own pocket, using the rents from her Devon manors to buy French mercenaries and Welsh longbows for a son she hadn't seen since he was a frightened 4-year-old child. Richard III was completely oblivious to what the quiet lady in the black hood was doing in the next room. He even gave her a big role at his coronation, where she walked directly behind the new queen. She was buying loyalty by the yard. She even got in touch with the Duke of Buckingham, the nephew of her second husband, who was supposedly Richard III's right-hand man, but had suddenly decided he hated his new boss and wanted to be a kingmaker himself. She kept her husband completely in the dark, or at least that's what they both claimed later, when the whole thing went pear-shaped. Stanley was busy being the perfect loyal servant to Richard, carrying the ceremonial mace at the coronation while his wife was quietly drafting the blueprint for Richard's destruction in a room just down the corridor. The summer of 1483, the two little princes just vanished from the face of the earth. The rumours started flying around the taverns almost immediately. Nobody really knew. Still don't, honestly. She must have realised that the disappearance of those boys completely transformed her son's destiny. If the princes were dead, then their older sister, Elizabeth of York, was now the primary heir to the Yorkist line, making that secret marriage pact Margaret had cooked up with the Queen in Sanctuary infinitely more valuable. Margaret didn't waste time worrying about the morality of the situation. She sent Christopher Urswick across the sea to tell Henry Tudor that the throne was effectively vacant if he could raise an army. Henry was 26 now. Richard III found out about the letters, of course. His spies were everywhere. He didn't arrest Margaret, though. He couldn't. Her husband, Thomas Stanley, was simply too powerful in the north, and if Richard had stuck Margaret's head on a spike, Stanley's private army would have marched south and taken London before the week was out. Richard contented himself with stripping Margaret of all her titles and lands, handing them over to Stanley to keep him sweet. He tried to humiliate her and keep her at his mercy, which was a stellar strategic move, aside from the minor detail that the money and land stayed within the family. Of course, Thomas and Margaret later used those exact funds to bankroll the Battle of Bosworth, and placing her under strict house arrest at one of the Stanley manors in the countryside. She was banned from having any servants who could write, and her doors were locked from the outside at dusk. He thought he'd neutralised her. He thought a woman without an inkwell was a woman without power, which was probably the biggest mistake he ever made in his short, brutal life. October 1483 was an absolute washout. The rain didn't just fall, it bucketed down for weeks on end, turning the River Severn into a sea and flooded half of Gloucestershire. This was the exact moment the Duke of Buckingham decided to launch his grand rebellion against Richard III, a plan that Margaret had spent months coordinating. Buckingham was supposed to march his Welsh troops across the river to join up with rebels in the south, while Henry Tudor sailed over from Brittany with a fleet of ships packed to the gunwales with French mercenaries. The floods were so bad that the Welshmen couldn't cross the Severn, and because they hadn't been paid in weeks and their boots were rotting off their feet, they basically just said, "Right, we're off," and wandered back to their hills. Buckingham was left standing in a muddy field with nothing. He tried to hide in a cottage belonging to one of his tenants, but the bloke ratted him out to Richard's men for a reward. They dragged Buckingham to Salisbury, didn't even bother giving him a trial, and chopped his head off on a wooden butcher's block in the middle of the market square outside a tavern. Henry Tudor's part of the plan went just as badly. His ships got caught in that same massive autumn gale that wrecked the rebellion on land, scattering his fleet all across the Channel until his own flagship was left bobbing alone. He looked at the shore and saw a bunch of soldiers waving at him to land, shouting that Buckingham was waiting for him with open arms, but Henry was a suspicious bastard by nature. You don't survive 14 years in exile by trusting random blokes on a beach, and he noticed their badges were Richard's white boars, not Buckingham's staff. He turned the ship around and sailed straight back to France, leaving his mother's grand conspiracy. Margaret must have been utterly devastated when the news reached her manor house. Richard was triumphant, executing every rebel he could get his hands on and sticking their limbs on gates from Exeter to York. Margaret was still locked up under the custody of her husband, and started rewriting the entire plan from page 1. Her network was broken, her cash was gone, and her main ally was a head shorter, but she still had her inkwell, and her boy was still alive on the other side of the water. 2 years bled into one another, leading inexorably to Bosworth Field, where 3 different armies sat on 3 different hills, watching each other. You had Richard III with the royal vanguard. Then you had Henry Tudor down in the bog, looking probably quite green about the gills since he'd never actually seen a real battle in his entire 28 years of life, and his army was mostly made up of rough French jailbirds and homesick Welsh archers. And then, sitting on the highest ridge like a bloke waiting for a bus, was Thomas Stanley. Margaret's husband had about 6,000 hardened northern troops with him. He hadn't joined Richard, and he hadn't joined Henry. He was just watching. Richard III was so furious about this that he'd actually taken Stanley's eldest son, Lord Strange, hostage before the battle, and he sent a messenger up the hill saying, "Join me now, or I'll chop your lad's head off in front of the tents." Stanley, being the coldest bastard in Christendom, apparently just shrugged and sent a message back saying, "Sire, I have other sons." The battle itself, was a total mess. Richard realised his nobles weren't really fighting for him. The Earl of Northumberland just sat his cavalry at the back and refused to move a single hoof. So Richard decided to end the whole thing in one mad, suicidal cavalry charge straight at Henry Tudor's personal banner. He roared down the hill like a madman, hammering through Henry's bodyguards, killing his standard-bearer with a single blow. He was only a few feet away from putting an inch of steel into Henry's throat when the Stanleys finally made their move. Sir William Stanley ordered his northern boys down the ridge, and they violently smashed into Richard's flank, dragging the king off his horse and into the mire. After the scramble, the gold circlet Richard had been wearing, which had rolled under a hawthorn bush, was recovered. It was stuck onto the lad's head, right there on a little hill called Crown Hill, while the blood-soaked soldiers screamed, "God save King Henry!" Margaret didn't just walk into London. She effectively took the keys to the entire palace from the moment her son, Henry VII, rode through the city gates with that blood-spattered crown. She immediately dropped her husband's name, Stanley, from her official signatures, which must have been a bit of a slap in the face for Thomas after his family had just won her son a battle, and she started signing herself Margaret R. Officially, the R stood for Richmond, her ultimate title, yet everyone at court knew exactly what she was playing at. She was styling it to look like Regina, Queen, which she wasn't technically. She had her own throne, right next to Henry's. The Tudors knew they had about as much legitimate right to the throne as the bloke who swept the stables, so they used etiquette like an iron cage to keep people from noticing the thinness of their pedigree. Margaret took charge of the royal nursery when the babies started arriving. She got her revenge on the old Yorkist regime by taking over their best houses, moving her massive household into Cold Harbour Court in London, and taking Collyweston Manor in Northamptonshire, which she turned into this colossal administrative headquarters where she ran her own private court of law. Thomas Stanley didn't seem to mind much, or perhaps he was just too terrified of her to say anything, since he spent most of his time up north pretending he was still a major player. She was finally the boss. Nobody could trade her, nobody could lock her up, and if a noble didn't like the way she signed her letters, he could go and explain his problems to her son's executioner at the Tower. The end of the story doesn't happen in a muddy ditch. It happens in the quiet, stone-walled library rooms of Cambridge, where Margaret spent her final, extremely wealthy years funding universities, because she'd decided that books were a far better monument than castles. She poured thousands of silver pounds into founding Christ College and St. John's College, which was basically her way of buying her way into heaven. Her son, the king, died in April 1509. His lungs finally gave out after years of being paranoid about rebels. She saw her grandson, Henry VIII. Then her own body decided it had had quite enough. She died on June 29th, 1509, just a day after Henry VIII's 18th birthday celebrations. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, who cast her effigy in solid bronze with her hands clasped in eternal prayer, the quiet, sharp-eyed lady in the black hood who had finally won her war. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments and subscribe if you'd like to hang out again.